Welcome back. Do you care if the sun is still out when you leave work? A bit of history. Daylight saving time was created in 1918 during World War I to save energy. The business industry liked it because you can get more done. A lot of moms and dads and pet owners are not crazy about it because, as a lot of us know, kids and pets and many adults don't take well to schedule changes. The question is it one of the top issues in the Florida legislature that it needs to take action on? State Senator Greg Steube thinks so, and joining us for more is State Senator Greg Steube, former State Representative Keith Fitzgerald, who teaches political science at New College, and Kevin Cooper, president of the Greater Sarasota Chamber of Commerce. If anything, what this shows us and what Jess just reported is you can go up to your state representative or senator in a place like a barbershop, suggest a bill that turns into a real bill in Tallahassee.
It's the greatest example of how a bill may become a law. I mean, there's not a better way of the citizenry and constituents coming to their elected official and saying, hey, this is something that we think needs to be changed. And it was interesting because, I mean, what you talked about beforehand did a good job of kind of talking about how it all happened. But as I walked into the barbershop, they were like, hey, we were just talking about you. And is this something you can change? Yeah, in this case it was. And, you know, it was something that at first I didn't think would be that big of an issue. And it's turned into something that affects all of us and has been an issue where if you look across the state, it's like 75–80% of folks think we should do away with swatching the times.
Keith, you've been there yourself, and you teach kids about how Tallahassee works. How many times in any legislative session do state reps and state senators bring along these types of bills, and how often do they get somewhere and how often do they not?
Well, first of all, I agree that people can actually influence their legislator to do things while they're up there. My friend Bob Graham, Senator Bob Graham, and Chris Hand wrote a little book, sort of a citizen's guide to how you do this. You can do it. Most people just don't have the wherewithal, the know-how, how to make it happen. So if you can figure it out, you can get things done. But one of the things that any legislator has to do, since it's very difficult for people to understand what they're up to, what they're actually doing, is sort of advertise their activity. And so a lot of legislators will put bills in that show that they are listening to their constituents. Most of them don't go anywhere. That doesn't mean that it's a useless thing to do or an unimportant thing to do.
Kevin, I've heard two things from the business community in the articles that I wrote. I mean, on one hand, businesses would like it to be lighter out, longer in the day. On the other hand, some businesses or corporations may not like the fact that they would be out of sync of surrounding states. We reported there are a handful of states that have eliminated daylight savings time, but not all. You know, what kind of things do you hear in our community?
Yeah, it's kind of a mixed bag in that respect, and I think what you need to consider when looking at those two sides of it is the short-term cost of adjusting to it and then the long-term benefit of it. And remember, business owners are citizens, just like those Senator Steube ran into, that are looking at, well, what happens with my kids? What happens with my dog? Do I want to get home from work at 6 o'clock when it's dark and not have any time to spend outside? And so they're looking at it from both sides of the things, and I would presume from a short-term cost perspective of adjusting the fact that, hey, we might be switching. But we have if you're doing a business around the country, Arizona, Hawaii, they don't practice this at all. And there's ways that we've found to do business in this state, have commerce cross state lines and do that. So presumably it can happen. It's not an insurmountable thing. And then the personal and business benefits that you might ignore from it could outweigh it.
Okay, we are just getting warmed up, and we'll have much more on daylight savings time right after we take a check of the first alert weather. Stay with us. Welcome back. Should Florida get rid of daylight saving time? And joining us for more is State Senator Greg Steube, former State Representative Keith Fitzgerald, who teaches political science at New College, and Kevin Cooper, president of the Greater Sarasota Chamber of Commerce. One interesting part of this is, you know, we have so many partisan issues in the state. This is not one of them, because I think you pointed out, Greg, that the last time this was proposed, it was in 2016 by a Democrat from Coconut Grove. But why didn't it go anywhere then?
He didn't have a Senate companion, so he filed a bill in the House, and there wasn't a Senate companion, so the bill basically died. And shortly after I filed the bill in the Senate, House leadership contacted me, and there's now a bill that's filed by Representative Nunez in the House, and she's in the leadership in the House, and I've got pretty good feeling that it'll probably move on the House side.
Speaker Corcoran?
Yeah, I mean, Speaker Jeanette Nunez is Speaker Corcoran's pro temp. So if she's filing a bill, that's a pretty strong signal that the House leadership is in support of the direction that's going.
Right. Now, there are pros and cons, and Kevin, I would imagine, and we were talking about this during the break, if Florida does this alone and surrounding states don't, what kind of problems does that cause business?
The problems are an adjustment period, and there's certainly a cost associated with it when you're talking about dealing with people out of different time zones. But, you know, across the United States, there's 4 different time zones. So those that are used to dealing outside of state commerce are already kind of used to a certain degree, dealing with different time zones. And so there's an adjustment period of understanding how does that work, where are my clients, where are my suppliers, how does this operate? And so that's the really key part of it. It's not a wholly, you know, out of the whack concept to think of dealing with different time zones inside the United States. We do that on a daily basis, whether you're getting on a plane, you fly somewhere, you land, you think you're late, but you're not late because the time changed and everything's fine. You can make that connection in Chicago even though the time zone is different. So it's really about the adjustment period. I think long term, the ramifications are minimal. It's really a short term, upfront, human nature cost of change, and that's the issue at hand.
And as I mentioned, this is something that has not been a partisan issue, but I would imagine, Senator, that there are a number of people who are watching this right now would say, geez, there are so many more pressing issues that the legislature has to deal with. We did a show yesterday on homelessness, and this keeps on coming up, how we are dead last in the country in spending on mental health and how much it costs us in other ways. Aren't those issues that you and other legislators should be spending more time on?
Well, there's a lot of issues. I think I have almost 50 bills filed this year. So in the Senate, we can get involved in a lot of different issues. And when you hear from your constituency that this is something that they want to see move forward, and you start a discussion and you see how much support there actually is in the state to move it forward, I think it's certainly an issue that needs to be discussed. And if it's something that the majority of the members support, we'll move it forward.
Keith, how does this usually work? What I have noticed in the Florida legislature is, you know, the bills keep plodding along, and then you reach a bottleneck at the end of the session, and how is it decided which bills come up for a vote in both houses and which don't?
So the main driver of what bills get heard and don't get heard are the parties. And in fact, the majority party, because one way of thinking about parties, this is a political science thing, is more than determining votes themselves, they determine what gets on the agenda. That's why they have rules committees in legislatures. It sounds like a boring thing to be on a rules committee. It's always one of the most powerful committees because they're figuring out what bills come up at what time and under what rules in conjunction with the leadership. So the leadership is the most important thing. The majority party determines what bills come up and don't come up. And you know, there's always in every legislature different rules about how autonomous committee chairs are or are not. In the state house right now, boy, committee chairs don't have a whole lot of power. It really comes out of the Speaker's office. Senators are a little more independent. They can move things a little more if they have a committee chair. So it varies. And I would say the cost of doing a bill is not really great if it's not controversial and if it's not a big gnarly thing that takes a great deal of staff time. Controversial bills generally have a lot of cost attached to them.
Right, but Senator, have you received any pushback from anybody in the legislature, Republican or Democrat?
No, and what's been interesting is, you know, I filed it because folks in my constituency thought it was a good idea to file it, and there's been such a huge outpouring of support from a lot of parents with young children that say, it takes my kids 2-3 weeks to a month to adjust to falling back on the times, and that they would really support the time change. So I think it's something that if you look across the state, it's like a 75-80% approval rate to do away with the time change.
And pets, I might add, because our dogs got up an hour earlier when we thought we gained an hour, but you know, I digress. But for a moment, let's talk about why the government started this in the first place. As we mentioned, it goes back to World War I in an effort to conserve energy, which is something that we still should be conscious of. Why not be as conscious of, or has technology change the fact that it's really not the same issue?
Well, it's interesting. In the early 2000s, the United States government extended daylight savings times by about 4 weeks, 2 weeks on either end. And part of that act was they required the Department of Energy to do a study to say, hey, did this have any impact? And what it showed, it was really de minimis. You did not see any massive change in energy consumption. I think it was about 0.3% change. But what you saw is you might save some energy in the summer, but then heating bills go up in the winter. And you see this, and especially now that we live in a different culture where you've got iPads, you've got electric vehicles, you've got a lot of different uses for a lot of different electricity consumption, where back in 1918, when this was first put in play during World War II, it was about fuel to light your home. It was about fuel to light the streets, and that's what it all was about. And so you have so many different things at play now, it's hard to really tell whether it has much of an impact. And that's why it makes such a great public policy study. It's not partisan, it's not incendiary like homelessness, it's not Republican, Democrat like taxation. It's a pure question of why do, what are the costs, and what are the benefits? And I think that's why it's a great conversation to have.
Also on that point, long-term versus short-term, because
that's right.
There would be upfront costs, no question about it. I don't know what they would be, but there would be some. Long term, it might be of benefit. I don't think anybody is crazy about this, and it's hard to say that it serves any particular purpose today.
But then the question obviously would be is why isn't the federal government taking this on? Because, and correct me if I'm wrong, what Florida would need to do is opt out of a federal law. If more and more people think this is the way to go, why isn't Congress just getting rid of it?
Well, they might. It usually takes Congress a long time to decide what to do once certain states start to do it. I mean, just look at medical marijuana, how long it's taken the federal government to do anything. They haven't done anything. You have, what, it's like 28 states now that recognize medical marijuana. So I think if Florida were to adopt this change, I think you'd see a lot of other southern states probably follow suit, and then Congress would probably say, okay, we've got a fair number of states that think this, you know, this was instituted back in World War I. It's not relevant to today, and states don't want to change their clocks back and forth. Let's just let them do what they want to do.
Well, it's not necessarily opting out of federal law. The federal law says you can choose A or you can choose B. It doesn't matter to us which one you choose. So the federal government isn't giving much guidance to the states. It just says, hey, if you're going to do this, that's fine. If you're going to do that, that's fine. There's very minimal guidance about where the time zone lines fall within the state in case a state falls in the middle of a time zone. They have some intricacies there, but yeah, it's not about opting out. The federal government hasn't given really stern, firm direction one way or the other. It says, hey, you can kind of do
well,
what
and on that issue with the two different time zones, because our panhandle is in Central Time, so they're an hour back, and I can't tell you how many people have contacted me and the senators in the districts that represent the panhandle who have said, we want to be in Eastern Time. We don't want to be an hour behind. So that may be something that we discuss as this bill moves forward to make the whole state into one time zone.
Two questions about that. So that is not part of this bill as
not
as
currently,
we speak.
but I think it will as it moves forward.
How did we get to a point where you had different parts of the state in different time zones in the first place?
No idea.
Well, it's just by geography, basically. The sun is setting earlier in one part of the state than the other. I mean, that's why we have time zones in the first place. That's fixed in nature. Not where the lines are drawn exactly, but just the fact that you need different time zones. But, about Congress, the United States federal government, Congress is going in the opposite direction of medical marijuana, so you can't count on them. And the other thing, the United States Congress is hardly doing anything. This last year was one of the lowest levels of legislation in modern times. So I don't think you can count on the federal government coming in and addressing an issue, even if it's not particularly controversial.
Well, that is the thing. I mean, if you're talking about medical marijuana, there are those who support it and who do not support it. This, as we have been talking about, is not something that traditionally has been a partisan issue.
Yeah, it's not, and I think to Senator Stubbe's point, I think if the dominoes start to fall with Florida, and Florida does the heavy lifting of showing how it can be done, I don't see any reason that other southern states wouldn't follow suit. Especially if you go with the House bill that says, hey, you're going to get an hour, when we hit daylight savings time, we're going to stay there. I think largely when you talk to people in an anecdotal sense, it's very popular amongst the constituency of, hey, I like summertime versus wintertime. They don't know the difference between standard and daylight saving, and so when you get there, I think you'd see the dominoes fall.
One more question. We have less than a minute left, but has this been assigned to committee yet?
Yeah, I have 3 committees in the Senate. I don't know about the committee references in the House, but I've got 3 committees in the Senate, and I've reached out to committee chair of the first committee, Community Affairs, it's Senator Lee, and I'm hopeful that he'll get it up in the first or second week of session.
Right, and is there, Kevin, Keith, very quickly, is there a secret in terms of if a bill is assigned to several committees, whether or not it's more or less likely to pass?
It depends on the rules. In some legislatures, it has to go through each and every committee. So the more barriers there are, the lower the chances. In others, it can pass out of any committee. So it depends on the rules of the particular legislature.
Okay, we have to take a quick break, and we'll be back for final thoughts in a moment. Our guest joining us right now for final thoughts. So, Senator, where do we go from here? How soon are we going to see whether or not this is going to get anywhere in the legislature?
Session starts January 9th. It's got 3 committee stops. Hopefully, if it gets up in the first committee that first week of session, then it's got 2 more committee stops, and you've got 8 weeks in order to get that through. And given that the House leadership is supportive of it on the House side, I think it'll move through the House. So I think it's just watching to see what happens on the Senate side and if the bill moves. And if it moves and if it starts to move through the process, I feel pretty confident that it'll pass.
Keith, I'm going to ask you a question I don't know if you have an answer for, but how many bills are filed in the legislature every year by the House and the Senate, and how many actually get voted into law?
You know, I forget the proportion mathematically. I think it's something like 1 out of 8 or something like that. I could be wrong. Now, senators file a lot more bills because they have no limits. In the House, you only get 6. So you're really careful about what bills you file. But still, the proportion of bills that pass to filed is pretty small.
And usually when it gets later into the legislative session, it becomes more difficult as the big ticket items.
One of the cool things about legislation is that time is a non-fungible resource. So as you move toward the end of the session, every minute you take on the floor that you're not passing bills, bills are dying. And so a lot of really intricate policy making gets made during those last several days.
Kevin, we heard a comment from Visit Sarasota saying that it does not believe that this bill will have an impact one way or another on our chief business around here, which is tourism. I mean, do you think that you're going to find parts of the business community which are not on the same page when it comes to this?
I think so. I think to a certain extent you might see retail businesses, restaurants that might want to see. I mean, what we know is that daylight encourages activity. People want to be out at St. Armand's Circle on Venice Main Street, walking around during the daytime, looking at into the shop, seeing what's going on. They want to sit outside on the patios and have dinner during dinner time. But at the same time, we have a lot of great amenities, cultural amenities that you're inside. It doesn't matter what time of day it is when you go to the Van Wezel. It simply doesn't matter. And so there'll be that tug and pull. But I think there's definitely some benefits to be had. And it depends. What does the tourism want? Where is the money going to flow during the difference in the daylight saving versus standard time? And that's the real question.
On the other hand, you had that fellow in the story who said that this will help Little League in terms of saving money. But on the flip side of that, we know how it is when our kids have to get up and go to school in the dark in the morning, which has some public safety issues.
Yeah, I had a number of different mayors and city leaders contact me and said that they support it because the city's going to save money, because later in the evening when they have to turn the lights on, they're going to save money in having to turn the lights on. So it kind of is both sides. I think the real frustration from the people that I've talked to, and especially parents, is when you have to turn back the clocks, that adjustment in time for children to have to adjust to losing an hour of time and getting up earlier and getting to school has been the main challenge. So regardless of what time we end up in, which I think the daylight savings time is the best, you don't have to flop your clocks back and forth, which I think is the biggest thing.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Before we go, we want to share with you what some of you had to say about last night's show on reports showing homelessness has declined over the past year. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development is boasting about a declining homeless population for Florida. The report shows a 4% decrease in homeless persons on a single night in Florida. Here on the Suncoast, homelessness dropped, but only 1.5%. We went to Facebook, and here are some of your thoughts. Felicity says, our community needs to pull together and help one another where we can, not as enabling addiction or giving cash to an able-bodied person who can work, but for volunteers, make a difference. It's just not the government's responsibility. It is ours too. April says lots of people lost their homes during the market crash and wages don't match cost of living. All I see is catering to rich and tourists to get out of area people to move here. Wait until the crash happens again, and it will. Well, if you'd like to join the conversation on tonight's topic, just visit our Facebook page at facebook.com/mysuncoast.com.abc7. And FYI, you can watch past discussions on demand. They're available on Apple TV, Amazon Fire, and Roku. And for the latest on local breaking news, don't forget to download the updated version of our app. If your current app doesn't work, that's because it's expired. Just go to the App Store and re-download it by searching for WWSB or My Suncoast. We want to thank our guests for being here tonight. State Senator Greg Steube, former State Representative Keith Fitzgerald, who teaches political science at New College, and Kevin Cooper, president of the Greater Sarasota Chamber of Commerce.